Well, okay, how about we dive in? Thank you for attending Wine and Wisdom with Whitney on Wednesdays. We have a very special guest this month, Kara Kazemba from Ancora Counseling and Therapy Services. Kara, we're so excited to have you here today to talk about right-sizing our relationships. I am going to read Kara's bio real quick. She is amazing, by the way. If you haven't had a chance to get to know her one-on-one, please reach out after this. As a therapist, Ancora Counseling began 5 years ago. As a therapist, Kara is fairly eclectic and pulls from a variety of approaches, including EMDR, DBT, attachment theory, somatic experiencing, and CBT. Her therapeutic style includes humor, bluntness where appropriate, and a healthy level of swearing. What drives her is the moment that a client remembers, regains, or finds their power or sense of self. Please welcome Kara Kazemba to Wine and Wisdom.
Thank you, Whitney. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. It was a long day of homeschooling, so I'm really excited that my last meeting of the day involves wine. So thank you for having me. Okay. So I'm going to be sharing my screen today. I encourage all of you, please interrupt me if you have thoughts, questions, something's not very clear. The nature of my life right now is a lot of these projects are done after my kids go to sleep. So if there's any errors or confusion, it's probably because it was late at night. But very excited to talk about this topic.
Karen?
Yes?
Do we get a copy of the slides?
For sure. Absolutely.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you for reading my bio for me, Whitney.
Devin will email them out after this.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to hear a little bit about who you guys are. So name, business name, or maybe how you know Whitney. And since we're talking about relationships, I thought it would be kind of fun to talk about who your first love was. So we already went over a little bit about who I am. One disclaimer I do want to give, I'm not a couples counselor. That's a little bit too many people sitting on my couch for my comfort. But what I do specialize in is helping people bring their best possible selves into the relationship. And I do that through exploring their childhood, past hurts, talking about trust and communication, a lot of the stuff we're going to dive into today. And my first love was Kyle Buffkin. We rode the same bus together, and he could say all of the presidents in order and knew all the state capitals. I tried finding a picture for you guys. He was definitely my ideal for fourth grade Kara. So, nerd. Thank you, JC. So I'd like to hear from you guys. Whitney or Devin, could you help me call on people so we can learn about everybody else, please?
Sure thing. One heck of an icebreaker, Kara. Who's brave enough to dive in? And if nobody is, then I'll go ahead and put
just got an hour, so let's go.
All right. So my first love is my high school sweetheart. His name is John Glenn, and he was the valedictorian of our high school class at Sunset High School. And we went off to college together, and we were together maybe 3.5 years. But the funny thing is I just spent like an hour and a half talking to him over the weekend. He needed help moving a player piano from Portland to Germany.
Oh.
That's really interesting, Whitney. That's so funny.
And yeah, there's the story. Yeah.
I have from Kyle. Anyone else feel like sharing?
I can go next since Whitney was so brave. My name is Devin. I'm an online business manager. The first person I ever remember loving was when I was probably in first grade. There was a boy in my class whose name was Kevin. And I felt like since our names rhymed that we were meant to be together. Aww. And I told him once, like, Kevin, isn't it weird our names rhyme? Like, we should probably get married. And he instantly ran away. And so that was kind of the end of that.
It was a short love.
It was very short, not reciprocated.
Anyone
Your
else?
logic is sound, though.
JC, who was your first love?
7th grade, crazy tall girl named Crystal.
Nice.
And let's see, she loved the song Strawberry Wine. And I carried around the CD in my backpack for so long that the wrapping came off. And when I did finally give it to her, her friends made fun of me because like I had listened to it and opened it. I'm like, no, I swear it was just in my backpack forever because I was too afraid to give it to her.
Adorable. Anyone else? Brian.
Aside from Judy Hartman, who was my neighbor, they were a neighbor family, and she would be, and I even got in a fight with another kid over her. He started it, but,
Sure.
and it was in front of the crossing, yeah, well, as I recall, but it was in front of the crossing guard who tried to break us up, and I remember she hit me in the forehead with her metal stop sign. So it gave me a big welt on my head, but I wore it with honor because I was fighting for Judy, you know. But anyway, since you offered to dive deep into what shaped our relationships and stuff, I'd have to say the first female that I loved was my mom. And I adored her for a long time, but then our family arguments and divorces and getting older and estrangement and shaped my relationship with her today and a lot of the relationships I've always been in. So.
Absolutely. We definitely dive into that a lot in therapy, right? Because we see how to treat future relationships based on what we grow up in. So thank you, Brian, for sharing that. Bill?
So this is how I respond to the question. So your name is William. Do you go by that? And I'll say, I'll go by any variation on William. But I have a female friend who goes back to about 3rd grade and my neighborhood. Her name is Debbie. And when I see her down in the Bay Area, she'll usually say, can I still call you Billy? I say, you can, because she was my first crush, my first love back then. And a little side note is that the first time I went down in recent years to the Bay Area and saw her, we go out for dinner in North Beach area, Italian restaurant. She arrived, she said, well, here we are, our first date 50 years later. And I said, are you trying to tell me something? She said, maybe. She was never available. Through high school, junior high, when we even went to the same college, and the only person in a class of about 600 people that went all the way through together. And she met her future and still husband the first day of college. Oh, well.
Wow.
I'd have to second what Brian said. My first, I'd say, female friend, yeah, was my mom. And I think it set the stage for my female relationships. And I think my business, which I didn't say, Cohen Caregiving Support, helping family caregivers, brought out my strong nurturing side.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. Would anyone else care to go before we jump on in?
Real quick. So Harold Kurt, if it has to be a person, her name would be Joni, but my real first childhood love was baseball. That's all that really mattered in my childhood.
Good one.
Okay, so if no one else needs to declare their love at this point in time, we'll move forward then. So today our objectives: drink wine. We're going to talk a lot about green flags and red flags. I'm really going to try keeping it focused on the positive. Obviously, by focusing on the positive, there's going to be some highlights of those red flags, right? But since we're keeping it light, I'm going to try to keep it positive. We'll talk a little bit about communication skills, because sometimes right sizing is just a matter of setting boundaries and letting people know how we're feeling. And then we'll talk about the kind of more extreme version of right sizing, which is like, we got to actually let someone go and how to grieve in that process. small disclaimer, right? So I am a therapist and I'm providing education for you today, but this is not group therapy. And I give that disclaimer because it is a big no-no for me to do therapy and drink wine at the same time. So that's why I keep emphasizing we're keeping it light and providing a lot of education and tools today, but sometimes what ends up coming up is some deeper stuff, and I'm happy to chat with you about referrals or anything like that, you know, after today, right? So there's my disclaimer. I'm going to drink some wine just to remind you, not therapy. Excellent. Okay. I also really like memes. So when we're talking about red flags and green flags, usually we talk about romantic relationships. A lot of these things can go in a variety of different circumstances though. Roommates, family, jobs, okay? So typically when somebody comes to me for counseling specific to relationships, I usually know a little bit up front, either from their email or their voicemail. And then after the initial consult, where they meet me for like 15, 20 minutes and decide that I'm lovely and would like to work with me, then we schedule the intake assessment, which I call the life story session. And in there, what I'm listening for is, how do people describe themselves? How do they describe this life? And what are their goals? How do they know they get to fire me as part of counseling, right? And the reason why I check in on self-care when it comes to relationships is, if you go at the very far end of the spectrum of codependency and relationships that don't look super duper healthy, the most boring self-care isn't happening. This is the whole idea of, please put your oxygen mask on first before you help other people. And then I listen for the things that make them who they are. So here's some things about me. Have you guys ever heard of the term relationship chameleon? That's kind of what I'm listening for in relationships. Do you form yourself to whoever this ideal version of who your partner wants, right? There should certainly be shared interests, but hopefully there are still some very core things that make you, you, right? Because that's what attracted that person to you to begin with. And you guys are going to see variations of this circle a lot, but when people are telling me their story, are they at the center of it? I have had intake appointments where I hear 45, 60, 70 minutes of hearing about their partner or their family, and I can't hear them anywhere within their own story. So ideally, the client is at the center of their story. And if they're not, that gives me kind of an idea of maybe where we should start. And then when we talk about goals, obviously when you're building a future with somebody or with an institution, right, there are things you want to work on together. I'll give it a job example for this one. So when my first baby was 3 months old, I was approached by my agency that I was working at, and they wanted me to become a program manager. Their goal was, they wanted their Hillsborough site to be dynamic, right? They wanted to expand to outpatient services and streamline the grants that we had happening out there. And they thought I would be the perfect person for the job. I was very sleep deprived at that point. I wasn't yet licensed. So I had my own goals of, you know, staying awake, getting my clinical license, and my own, you know, career path. So we were able to negotiate at that time, yes, company, I can support you with your goals. However, these are a priority, and these are my kind of hard and fast rules for how I'm going to support my career as well as being a new mom, right? So individual and shared goals is a huge green flag. You'll see this table kind of ongoing in the presentation. Here's another meme. I like memes, guys. They're funny. I'm a millennial, so there are some people who very much recognize this about themselves when they come to our appointments, right? Okay. The other thing I listen for when I'm working with folks is boundaries. And boundaries look like a lot of different things. The first boundary that I obviously notice is, especially in shared living situations, does my client even have the privacy and the time to come to our appointment and be not interrupted for an hour, right? That is a huge boundary. And ideally, the people in your life should support you if you say, hey, I have counseling for an hour, I'm taking care of myself. Can you not interrupt me for that span of time, okay? In a nutshell though, healthy boundaries involve taking responsibility for your crap and everybody else takes responsibility for theirs. It sounds very simple, but it's very easy to kind of skirt the line of boundaries sometimes. Personal disclosure that sometimes I struggle with is I'm a therapist. I want to help people. I'm generally very caring. Oftentimes, I will offer time and support to other people before recognizing that I should just take responsibility for myself first, right? We're all learning and growing. So when I'm listening, some things that tend to pop out at me, oversharing for one. Oftentimes, it's completely normal for someone not to tell me their full story in their intake assessment. Why would they? They've largely just met me. They barely know me, right? They've kind of got an idea for what a conversation with me feels like. But sometimes it takes time. I also listen for things like, you know, if they had to be really responsible from a young age. I listen for secrets, like I don't feel comfortable sharing that with people, keeping people at arm's length, right? There are several things that tend to pop out at me in terms of whether or not boundaries are a little bit too loose or too rigid. So here's that circle again, right? When I talk about oversharing, what I often mean is that your story is sacred. If the person at the bus stop, this guy up here, ends up knowing your trauma story, my question is why, right? Because a few things can happen with that. One, trauma bonding, which we'll get into a little bit more in a second. But two, your story comes with, it also comes with sharing your vulnerabilities. It comes with sharing the things that would make you feel happy and feel safe. And it should take time to trust someone with that information, right? So ideally, and this can kind of shift a little bit, but oftentimes your partner is at the center of that, you know, or your best friend. Hopefully your therapist is a little close to the inner circle too. And there might be some family, not all of it, right? You get to decide how much you tell people, and they should earn that privilege by showing you that they can show up as a dependable person for you. And this is a little bit of what I'm talking about with trauma bonding. Sometimes what happens is we end up getting trapped in the rescue triangle. So when you're trauma bonding, sometimes it comes out as I was the victim in this circumstance. And what ends up sometimes happening is you attract rescuers, right? And you bond together against the perpetrator, right? Fair enough. The challenge is sometimes people with boundary challenges always have to live in this triangle, right? And it might not always be with them, the victim. Sometimes they might get trapped in wanting to be the rescuer and seek out ways where they can help and feel that sense of purpose where they are the rescuer. So something to keep in mind. And then the last thing I encourage you to think about with boundaries is intensity. This, again, happens with trauma bonding sometimes. But when I hear it from my clients, it's, I met this person and it was so intense. I feel like we've known each other forever. Usually they have told each other their whole life stories by now. What ends up coming up, however, is it's not just the beginning part that's super passionate and very flammable. It's also their conflict. And it ends up being very hot and cold, right? And in some really extreme circumstances, someone will light a fire just because that feels a little bit more normal to them. When I'm working with people on building some insight and awareness in this situation, Sometimes I'll make the analogy of like, yes, a raging fire is very cool and exciting, right? You might not be able to sit that close to it though. And you certainly can't roast a good marshmallow, right? It's just gonna burn up. So think about a fire that's just, that's burning nicely versus one that's just up in flames. And honestly, sometimes a little scary, right? So back to the idea of green flags and red flags. Trust is gained, right? Trust should be gained. There are certainly people out there who have on those rose-colored glasses, and more power to you. And also it's really good to protect yourself and protect your story. There absolutely should be a balance of passion and stability, right? Things can be really hot and exciting, right? Go have that bonkers sex. And also stability, being able to fold socks with somebody is good too. And with that, disagreements and discussions should be respectful, right? Hopefully there's no fire in those. And then going back to that rescue triangle, everyone should come into the relationship willing to work on themselves. In friendships and family and relationships, we all want to help one another. That's a beautiful thing. But there's also this expectation that we all work on ourselves too. And then obviously we're all going to take responsibility for ourselves. All right, brief cat break. This is Mr. Pickles. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions?
I haven't. No, this is so awesome. I have an initial question that has come up for me over and over again in my own therapy around boundaries and relationships with like friends or partners. And it goes both ways of what do we owe each other? Like if we're in a situation and someone else is hurting, at what point does it turn from like, I'm taking care of you because I love you and you just need me right now, and to we're kind of sucking my energy? Like, I guess there's no hard and fast rules to know the difference, but what do you think about that? Like, how do you know the difference?
Well, we're actually going to be talking about energy on the very next slides.
Woo, then I'll wait.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Can we talk more about that bonkers sex you were mentioning?
Strongly recommended. Moving on.
How did Mr. Pickles get his name?
He was originally my sister's cat a long time ago. And one of the Kazemba family traits is we all really love pickles. That's all I could tell you. Yeah. And we call him Mr. Pickles now because he's geriatric, so you need to speak to him with respect. Call him Mr. Okay, so let's talk about energy.
Saying Mr. Harold, right?
Yes, Mr. All right, so let's talk about energy. Quite simply, where does your energy go and who gives it back? And as Devin pointed out, do you feel drained after certain interactions? We can all kind of think of those people in our head, right? We could probably also think about, you know, those folks that come to us and they're like, hey, how you doing? And you kind of pause because you know they're just waiting for their turn to speak, right? So this is called an eco map. This is a very simplified version, but I will literally have my clients map this out with me. Okay? Who are the people and systems in your life, and where does the energy go, and who gives it back, right? Because this can be a good indicator of where you need to set boundaries and who you maybe need to cut out. This job, for example, you give a lot to your job, the pay is kind of shit, you know, it doesn't really give you much at the end of the day. As opposed to volunteering, it's hard work, but you get some warm fuzzy feelings and you enjoy the people you volunteer with. So it's a two-way street for the energy. Right? And sometimes things change too. We also talk about energy should respond to different circumstances. So kind of back to Devin's question of how do you know that like too much is too much? my question is, does the energy ever change? Do you always have to be inputting, or does sometimes the energy come back to you a little bit more? My partner and I will occasionally joke about, like, whose turn is it to lose our shit this week, right? And we joke about that, but there's some truth to it, where sometimes we have more energy to give our partner and sometimes we have less, and that's okay. And sometimes we need more, and hopefully we're asking for more appropriately. And sometimes we don't need as much support, love and support. But kind of going back to either the rescue triangle or thinking about that fire, the question of, if you're always giving energy, is it because you're trapped in that rescue triangle? Or is somebody always starting fires that need to be put out? So those are some questions that I would ask to kind of dive into that a little bit more. So before we get into right sizing, any other thoughts, questions, forwards?
Yeah, Kara. A couple of people on here probably know that early this year I was doing some thinking about these kind of issues, both about relationships and organizations, and realized that they were toxic, unfulfilling, draining in time, energy, and not getting much benefits back. And I just said, I'm getting out of them. You know, they just weren't for me, even though I was in leading roles, you know, or official, or I had actually started one of the organizations. Happened to be a couple of people who were in both organizations. So it was a common thread going on there, and it just fed that toxicity, that draining that I just couldn't stand. So I set my boundaries, and yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Cutting people and organizations out, like you say here, right?
Absolutely. And a good way of checking in on that is, are you dreading those meetings, right? Hopefully not. If you are dedicating, let's say, an hour of time a week to something, it shouldn't be something that either gives you anxiety, that you have anxiety dreams about, that you just don't want to show up for, right? So that's a really, Bill's like, yes. So thank you for sharing.
Or more than a couple hours a week.
Boy. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Well,
I just, go ahead.
okay, so I have a question with that triangle thing.
Mm-hmm.
The rescuer and the victim. I don't get who's the perpetrator. That's the part. Is the perpetrator the initial person who created the trauma? I'm just confused by that.
Oftentimes, I'm gonna go back to it. Here. Right.
Yeah.
So when people are living in the rescue triangle, the perpetrator could be anybody, and oftentimes it shifts. So, for example, if somebody always wants to be in the victim role and they're reaching out to you and they're saying, rescue me, you decide, let's say, to set a boundary and not do that.
Right.
You could very easily shift into the perpetrator role, right? So oftentimes the perpetrator, there's oftentimes a very real hurt that's attached to the perpetrator, but sometimes, just like the creating a fire, the perpetrator is, I need somebody to blame right now, right? And then similarly, I need someone to rescue me, right? And the rescuer and the victim align in such a way that feels very powerful and can be very intoxicating. So not all relationships are like this. This is a pretty far end of the spectrum where some serious boundary work would need to be done.
But Kara, too, there are people that actually live as victims all their life.
Mm-hmm.
They're always being wronged by somebody, and they always need a comforting ear to hear their sob story.
That can be accurate. So again, my suggestion is be aware of if you're trying to get sucked into that triangle, right? And that's where we will be talking about some boundaries coming up here.
On the other hand, Kara, I thought I was okay, and now I've got to go back and reevaluate.
It's a lot of work to do some of these things. All right. So let's talk about right sizing, which is, what we're talking about today for Wine and Wisdom. We don't always have to think about cutting people out. When I was talking to a friend of mine about this, she's like, awesome, you're going to teach people how to ghost people. And I'm like, no, not quite. Because sometimes right sizing is just adjusting. There can be people in your life that are just kind of a drag that you don't have to cut out. You just kind of have to distance yourself a little bit. So we're going to talk about correcting boundaries first. And apologies to anyone who hates conflict, but boundary setting is mostly communication. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. Start simple and get a little bit more complex. And normalizing that this can be extremely challenging if you've had a lot of hurt before, if you've been in toxic relationships before. Conflict and setting boundaries might feel very icky to the point where you're like, well, obviously this isn't normal, right? Because we get trapped in this idea of what relationships are supposed to be, because obviously our past unhealthy ones were wrong. So, tip number 1, no is a complete sentence. There are people in your life that will deserve a little bit more than no, but it's not everybody. And it's not always, and oftentimes more than not, the more that you keep it simple, the easier things go. Because sometimes we get so trapped in explaining ourselves that we end up losing our position on the field, so to speak. So the no is perfect for, hey, can you work overtime? Hey, would you like to go on a second date? Variations of that. Real true story, I did actually use this one. If you message me again, I'll tell your mom, which is a good reminder to keep your Facebook profiles pretty private, because then if you're messaging people inappropriately, someone could find your mom and message them. So that was a lot of fun and a great boundary to set for someone who's being inappropriate. Now getting a little bit more detailed, I feel statements. This is kind of the quintessential cliche couples therapy thing. Oftentimes we get to where we're adding thoughts in, we're doing finger pointing, and we're not necessarily including our feelings in it. And more often than not, the person that we're in a relationship with, whether it be romantic, friendship, or otherwise, they don't want to hurt us. And sometimes if we just say how we're feeling, we can avoid some of that hurt in the future. So this is one step towards setting a boundary. So there's a big difference between I came home and you left the kitchen a freaking mess, I'm not your maid, take care of your crap. Right? That doesn't sound very warm and cuddly, right? Versus I feel disrespected when I come home after work and I see dishes in the sink, right? Dishes in the sink is very objective, right? It's not adding your flavor to it. It's a fly on the wall could see there's a sink and there are dishes in it. In the future, it would make me, add another feeling word, it would make me feel really appreciated if we all could do our own dishes. Right? So you're not finger pointing, you're keeping it calm, and you're keeping it objective. And then this is my favorite communication tip, which is I feel statements, but kind of on steroids. So the D is describing the situation. Again, it's as objective as possible. The E is expressing how you feel. So I came home and there were dishes in the sink. That made me feel disrespected, overwhelmed, exhausted, however you want to put it. And then the A is assert. I'm going to get into being confident in a couple steps, but assert also needs to be clear. Asking someone for help is very vague, and everyone's idea of help is different. Versus please do the dishes, right? That's very clear. Clean up the mess, right? Does that mean wiping down the counters? What does that mean? And then reinforce, that's the idea, I'm slightly nihilistic, that we all only do things because there's some sort of buy-in for us. And that even goes for our partners and people who care about us. So what is the buy-in for somebody helping you out? What is the buy-in for you setting this boundary and them respecting it? Right? In very extreme circumstances, this reinforce might sound a little bit like an ultimatum. My client recently did a beautiful job using Dear Man. They did it in an email, but they said, you know, Mom, I love you. If you can't respect my gender, then I can't have you in my life. Right? So in that case, the reinforce was, I love you and I want you in my life. And if you can't respect me, you're not going to be in it. Right? And that sucks. Be mindful literally just means stay on the current argument. I'm sure we all have been in those circumstances where somebody brings up some slight from months or even years ago. This is just like that time you did da 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 da. Not super helpful, because suddenly now you're not talking about the thing that's currently happening. Suddenly you're rehashing old crap. And all it does is amplify the argument. Okay. So stay on the current argument, be mindful, stay present. A, is appear confident, which goes back to your what you're asserting or what you're asking. If you want something, ask for it. Don't skirt around it. Don't add the if it would be convenient for you, if it's okay. If you're asking for it, it's something that's important to you, and own that. And then the N is negotiation, which is optional. There are some things that you do not have to negotiate for. My client, who their mother was not respecting their gender, right? That's non-negotiable. They represent as that gender. They want people in their life to affirm their gender, and it's not okay to be disrespected like that, because that's their values. And there's going to be non-negotiables for you too, and that's okay. Decide going in before you even start this process if you're willing to negotiate and how far. Bringing it back a little bit lighter, right? Maybe someone says, yes, I can help you with the dishes, but I don't have time to sweep the floor. Great, dishes would be amazing, right? Figure out what you're willing to negotiate. This is my dog, Baxter. I did a little bit of Dear Man for him. So he's saying, I'm sitting here looking all cute and I feel very neglected because I need some ear scratchies. And if you do that for me, I will love you forever. Dogs are the best. Any thoughts before we move forward?
Goats are better.
Goats are better. They do give milk. Anyone else?
This method reminds me a lot of nonviolent communication. And when I started using that method of communicating, it totally transformed a lot of my relationships and how I interacted with the world. It's just like, I feel like just being objective and saying how you feel and then making a request, like no one can argue with objective facts and your feelings, which are also facts, you know, like I do feel this way. So I really love this variation of that.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just has me doing a lot of thinking, looking back over different relationships and what I could have done and didn't do.
There's always room for growth and improvement, right? And there's so many different relationships that you have now that I think we all could benefit from good communication. I wish they would teach communication skills in high school. I think probably I would lose a lot of clients if we actually taught good mental health and communication in school, but I think it would be huge. All right, my last tip is treat people according to the ring they deserve to be on, or the circle they deserve to be on, by managing expectations. So much of our frustrations with people, and sometimes our desires to maybe cut people out of our lives, are because we're treating them like they are in our innermost circle, and then maybe they're actually not. Here's the circle again, guys, I warned you. Okay, so let's say I'm planning a party for myself for my birthday. My expectations of my partner should be, and will be, very different from, say, my partner versus my colleagues, right? A lot of times what ends up happening is we make friends, we feel like we're really connecting with them, but they're newer friends, right? That doesn't mean they're bad, right? They just haven't quite worked their way into that inner circle. But then maybe we make a request of them or have an expectation of them that's more likely reserved for this inner spot, right? We expect them to show up for us in a way that they're not quite ready to do yet. And that's through no fault of their own, because maybe they are operating like they're on this ring of your circle, right? So checking in with yourself on who are the people in my life, and do I have them in the correct ring of my little circle thing? And what are my expectations of them accordingly? So that can really help you determine, do I need to set a little bit more boundaries? Right? Do I need to maybe rely on these people a little bit more and stop going outside of my inner circle? Because all that's doing is setting myself up for hurt. That doesn't feel super good. And then I love this reminder, and I probably say it at least once a day in my various counseling sessions. The people who are getting upset with you about asserting boundaries are the people who are benefiting from you not having them. This process is not necessarily going to be very smooth or very easy, right? Because there's going to be some resistance when you shift up the dynamics of a relationship. The healthy relationships will survive this. The ones that are a little less healthy, and we're going to be talking about next, they won't. They'll keep pushing those boundaries, and then we'll have to talk about cutting them out. So, other reminders. These are things I already said for the most part, but taking responsibility for yourself. Devin mentioned these are my feelings, right? Your feelings are the thing that you have responsibility over. When we're using dear man or I feel statements, we are certainly bringing light to people's behaviors, and that's on them, okay? But sometimes after a certain point of people not changing their behaviors, sometimes we then just have to either set a boundary so we don't give them that opportunity anymore, or modify how we react to those situations. Because again, our feelings are our responsibility. I always like checking in with people when they talk about dear man going poorly, or they're like, I had a conversation and it went totally wrong. I ask, like, how did it start out? What strengths did you have going into that conversation? Oftentimes, I tell people, were you hungry, right? Have a snack before you go into those discussions. Make sure you've had enough sleep. Don't go into it without a full arsenal of wellness, right? Especially if you know it's going to be a challenging shit show. I apologize for swearing. If you're one of those people that struggle with saying no, try telling yourself instead that this isn't a priority. That can help some of the guilt stuff. And then lastly, I alluded to it before, you can do all of these skills beautifully and it can still go terribly, right? Because there are two people in an interaction and you have no power and control over how they respond. You might be completely objective and collective, and the other side goes completely the other direction, right? And then again, it comes back to what's your responsibility? Any thoughts or questions before I move on to the next one? I recognize we're running out of time.
Yes, I have a question. On that slide before, it said instead of saying, I don't have the time, you would tell the person this isn't a priority. I think that would be a very hurtful thing to say. I think that would be kind of hurtful to say.
I was more referencing it as if you're struggling with the guilt of saying, I don't have time, like that's in your head.
Oh, that's in your head. I get it. That makes sense. Yes.
No, usually, yeah, if you say, sorry, you're not a priority for me, or this activity is a priority, that might go over poorly. I completely agree.
Yeah. Okay, I need some clarification there. Thank you.
No problem. Anyone else?
This is all resonating with me so much. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, so this section is going to be a lot more brief than other sections, because as many of us know, grief is kind of messy and complicated. And when it's time to say goodbye, there's going to be a lot more unpacking that needs to be done. And there's not a magic formula for that. So this is a little bit more brief. But first, we're going to talk about, like, how do you say goodbye? And the first question that comes with that is, what was the relationship? Because you're going to say goodbye in a very different way depending on the circumstance. And that's largely about, again, communication. And notice how I put communication or not, that's fine. For people who have been in your life a long time, a formal conversation might both give you some closure, as well as very firmly communicate your boundaries with how things will move forward. If it's a particularly messy, let's call it breakup, or boundary setting or cutting out situation, consider a public place. Hopefully that means it will be less of a spectacle, and you won't get yourself trapped in a situation where somebody's crying in your house and you're like, how do I get them out of my house? Right? Just logistics. If that's not appropriate, or let's say you just struggle with in-person interactions with that individual, whether it be because of trauma, or maybe there is a lot of passion, so you worry about seeing them in person because next thing you know, things will go one direction and your clothes will be off. Letter writing is great as well. Okay. You can do Dear Man in a letter, you can say goodbye in a letter, you can make your boundaries clear in a letter. I do mention ghosting on here. It is an option. I usually ask people, okay, what was the relationship and what will ghosting end up leading to? I've been ghosted before and it doesn't feel very good. And it was by someone who I considered a really close friend. It certainly is a way of setting a very firm boundary, but it also leaves a lot of unanswered questions. And for, let's call them the more persistent people, they might continue reaching out until they get their answer. So, is ghosting an option? Sure. It does have its consequences though. And like I mentioned before, usually if you're at this point where you're looking at cutting someone out and saying goodbye, it's because you've tried to set boundaries and it has continuously failed. So I like warning people, saying goodbye might be an ongoing process where you have to be a broken record as well, right? It's very rarely just a, okay, I'll see you later, right? Because you've tried setting those fences up before, right? And then lastly, think about all of the ways where you need to break ties. How often do you see them? I always encourage people to make sure that their social media is either blocked from the other person or something like that, because you think you're moving on and then suddenly you see someone scoping on your Instagram stories who you thought was out of your life, and that can bring up a bunch of feelings. So if it's a hard and fast, you don't want to see this person anymore, you would like to move on and heal, break all ties and make it clear how, in your communication, how that's going to go moving forward. And then let's not forget that the fact that we have to cut people out kind of sucks. So it's not a death, but it is a mourning process of what you thought the relationship was supposed to be, what it was. It might have been an idealized version of it, right? That doesn't make the pain necessarily less. So honor what you had and what they brought to your life for that period of time. Maybe it was just that they taught you a very painful lesson, right? But because they taught you that lesson, you are now at a different spot in your life today. I mentioned my job earlier that I had before I started Ancora. I honored what that job gave me, right? It certainly gave me career advancement. It gave me opportunity. And I had some real sadness about what I thought it was supposed to be. It's okay to mourn that, right? In personal disclosure, I live like 2 miles away from the office that I worked at. So I drive past it every day. So I get a great reminder of it quite often. That's okay. Journaling can be a great grieving process, writing down your thoughts, and then some sort of ritual. Us as a society, we are very grounded in rituals, right? That's why we do funerals. Sometimes we need a funeral or some sort of ritual for a lost relationship or for something new. Okay. Has anyone seen those amazing trash the dress sessions that happen after divorce? Because those are legit. There are a lot of fun ways that you can mourn, get out your anger, and then focus on moving forward. And then, like I said, one of the best ways is to start with closure, which is largely on you. Right? The best way to honor your boundaries and the fact that you've closed that door is by you moving on. I've heard a lot from people grieving death. Well, this loved one wouldn't want me to be so sad, right? There is this idea of, yes, honor that relationship and what it meant, and now move forward, right? Take those lessons with you and learn to trust again. And that trust not only goes for new people coming into your life, new opportunities, new organizations, but it also means learning to trust yourself again, right? That you can choose the right one. Make sense? All right. This is the love of my life, Baxter again. And then I've included some resources that I love sharing with my clients. Wired for Love and Attached are both grounded in attachment theory. It can be very helpful for understanding why we react the way we do in relationships. Getting Past Your Past is very trauma focused, but still like solid. The Happiness Trap I include in here, it's not particularly about relationships, but it definitely challenges that notion of good things are just supposed to come to me. It's really about going out there and getting it yourself. Anything by Brene Brown, I Want to Be Her When I Grow Up. Gottman is the relationship guru. If I were ever to go into couples counseling, I would be certified in Gottman style therapy because they're amazing. And lastly, although it pains me to say so, love language is a pop psychology thing, but there is a lot to be said for it. So if you don't know your love language, I encourage you to look into that. It can be a great way of communicating your needs in a relationship. All right, that is it. So, questions, anybody?
Thank you so much, Kara. Wow. Anybody have questions for her?
No, perfect. Great. Thanks, guys.
I think we're all just taking it in.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, just so much great information. And as people said throughout, like it just sparked, memories and just things to really think about and maybe examine past relationships, examine current relationships. You've given us a lot of information and tools today. It's phenomenal. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, at the end of this month, y'all, we are celebrating our 5-year anniversary in business as Big Rocks. And we're going to do an Ask Me Anything Zoom event. And for every question that you ask, we're going to be donating money to the fire victims in the Willamette Valley in Oregon to the United Way. So we hope that you'll come. Feel free to wear a costume. It's going to be on Wednesday, October 28th at our usual Wine and Wisdom time from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific. And we're going to be in the hot seat. So Devin will be there, I'll be there, and we'll have all of our team members there. And so you can ask us anything you want. It could be organizing related, it could just be random questions, but we encourage you to come. Devin will send out the link for that and more information. And it should be a lot of fun. And also for the month of November, we're going to be donating a certain percentage of our work that we do with clients will also be donated to that Fire Victims Fund from Big Rocks. And then November 18th, we're going to talk about right-sizing your attitude with gratitude. So we'll send out information about that too. Thank you so much for being here.
Is that November 18th?
Yes, November 18th. Yeah, and then October 28th is our 5-year anniversary party.
Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you. And you can bring wine to that one too. So, Kara, I just can't thank you enough. This was phenomenal.
Really great. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing.
Thank you so much.
A lot of great information.
Thank you everyone for coming. So good to see all of you.
Thanks, Devin.
Keep up the great work.
All right. I'll see everybody next time.
Bye-bye.
Deb.